Hello, you're listening to Abstract AF and I'm Sneha Jaiswal. I'm going to be talking about the novel To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which was first published in 1927, almost 100 years later. Is the book still relevant and worthy of its modern classic tag? Well, that's debatable, but I'm only going to talk about what I thought of the book. I chose this as my first read for the year 2023, a regrettable decision because my first 4 days of the year were spent struggling to finish the novel, which is just about 200 pages, by the way. And if I really enjoy reading a work, it's not too difficult to finish even 500 pages in a day. But that wasn't the case with To the Lighthouse. So, first, let me summarize the plot for those who are listening and have maybe not read the book. The novel follows the Ramsays, a seemingly happily married couple who aren't very wealthy but comfortable enough to own a beach house where they go to spend their summers in and host about 10 to 15 guests. The Ramsays have 8 kids, and Mrs. Ramsay, their hostess, is the primary protagonist. The first chapter starts off with her youngest son, James, asking if they can go to the lighthouse the next day. And while Mrs. Ramsay encouragingly says that they can, her husband asserts that the weather isn't right for such a visit. Now, multiple times in the first few pages, Mrs. Ramsay thinks about how it's terrible for the father to douse the hopes of his son in such a matter of fact way. She thinks to herself how the boy will remember the disappointment for the rest of his life. Apart from that, the story is just about how Mrs. Ramsay is a beautiful and entertaining hostess and loves playing a matchmaking auntie by trying to set her guests up with each other. That's just what the first half of the novel is about. Mrs. Ramsay hosting people, her guests being in awe of her beauty, and her husband, who's a philosopher and author, being a needy, attention seeking man. Suddenly, in the second half of the book, readers are informed that Mrs. Ramsay is dead and that nobody goes to the beach house for the next 10 years. When they do, one of the guests reminisces about what a great woman Mrs. Ramsay was, and how her philosopher husband is nothing but a pale fading shadow without her. So, in a sense, this is about a beautiful woman hosting people at a beach house, and some of her guests remembering her fondly when she dies. My interest to read this book kept dying after every page. Both Virginia Woolf's storytelling and language isn't very fluid. Unlike some novels where the author's prose is so powerfully smooth that the chapters are easy to read even if the story is tedious. With To the Lighthouse, I neither found the barely their story interesting nor the descriptions that were tediously laid between the minimal action that unfolds. As far as the characters are concerned, most of them are extremely forgettable and none of them experiences much growth unless you consider the literal aging of some of the people in the story, since we meet some of them after 10 years. If I were a literature student, which I was by the way, and had to write a character analysis for Mrs. Ramsay, I'm afraid I would be at a loss for quality words. I do like the fact that she isn't your typical teen protagonist or someone naive in her early 20s. Although, if the author hadn't mentioned her age in the book, one would never be able to guess that she's in her 50s. Her strongest character trait seems to be her physical beauty, and of course, she's a loving, caring mother, but that's not a unique trait now, is it? The best picture you get of Mrs. Ramsay is through the eyes and mind of a character called Lily Briscoe, who's an artist in her early 30s who thinks of Mrs. Ramsay as a giver and her husband as a man who only takes and takes and takes. Now, I don't know what the popular interpretation of Lily Briscoe's character is, but I feel like Virginia Woolf either meant her to be a lesbian or a bisexual, because Lily's affection for Mrs. Ramsay seems to be quite strong and more than platonic. Considering the novel came out in the 1920s, Woolf obviously does cloud Lily's feelings for Mrs. Ramsay as a domestic kind of love for her way of life. Just the fact that Woolf at some point feels the need to clarify that Lily's love for Mrs. Ramsay is not limited to the woman, but for the entire family, gives some readers reason to believe that Lily had a romantic interest in the older lady. In the second half of the novel, Lily desperately feels the need to have Mrs. Ramsay back in the beach house, and she emotionally and tenderly reminisces about their time together. If this really was Virginia Woolf's subtle attempt to slip in an unrequited love plot, then it is a move worth noting, although it doesn't change the fact that the novel was mind numbingly boring. Was Lily Briscoe in love with Mrs. Ramsay, or did she just desire to be Mrs. Ramsay herself, a woman of great beauty and charm, with a happy brood of children who adored her? It's not really a question worth debating. And now I'd just like to talk about the significance of the title to the lighthouse. Little James gets to visit the lighthouse 10 years later, ironically with his father because his mother is no more. And anybody who is or has been a literature student, or even if they're used to reading literary works, you can surmise that it was Mrs. Ramsay who was the lighthouse, really. A woman who brightened up a room with her mere presence. And without her to lighten up things, those who basked under her attention are lost. To me, as a 21st century reader, To the Lighthouse felt outdated, even though it has eternal themes like love and war. But I couldn't be bothered to care about a matchmaking auntie who lives in her own bubble, is financially stable enough to afford a cook and a bunch of people to look after their vacation home when they're not around. What were her hopes, dreams, aspirations? What does she want to be beyond a mother and a hostess? I don't know, even after 200 pages that were quite frustratingly difficult to sail through. Despite my massive disappointment with the novel, I do intend to read Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is considered to be a superior work by most critics. I can only hope it really is. That's all from me. Talk to you the next time.